So I gave you the outline of the stuff. We probably will not be able to cover every single one of these. So I think Tammy told me that I have 8 classes, so we may get to 8. We may, 7 or 8 probably good. But the basis is, and this is what the notes here are about. Let's see, that's just what you have on the paper. This is a misnomer. I don't know why they're teaching it this way. Well, we'll talk about why they are teaching it this way. But the reality is that all those issues that I gave you on the paper, you probably think that most of these are all about opinions, or your opinion, or my opinion. And they're not about opinions at all. It's kind of like, when we look at the Bible, right, if you look at it in Hebrew, or if you look at it in the Greek, all of a sudden, many of the issues that we think we have about doctrine, theology, and things disappear, because if you understand the original language, suddenly things become incredibly clear. And I think that other issues, especially if you know the tools, and that's what I want to give you, are the tools to know truth. Now, I'm going to talk about this as we go through it, but if you had gone to school, not just college, if you'd gone to school to the 8th grade before the turn of the century, not the 21st century, the 20th century, you would have gotten everything that I'm going to tell you throughout your schooling years, and you would have learned all this. We'll talk about why it's not taught today and some of the issues that we have, that people have with this, the reason it's not taught, but that's part of what we'll look at. But these are not really issues of opinion. These are issues purely of fact. And when we look at when we begin to look at these, I know you have to have a little faith, right? Yeah, you have to have a little faith that that's true, because as we dig into it and you learn the tools to know truth, which are not new, they've been known for thousands of years, then it may become suddenly clear to you. And I'll try to make it clear to you.
You can't just feel these things?
What's that?
You can't just feel these things?
No, this isn't about feeling or opinion. That's what I got down here. This is what I always tell my classes on this. Each of the issues can contain aspects of opinion, but many of them don't, or better said, here's all these issues, like most issues, it's 95% data and knowledge, about 4% conclusion, and about 1% opinion. So, how can that be? A great example is language. If we're speaking together, are there right and wrong ways to speak English? You have grammar. Do you remember all the rules that you learned when you were in school? If someone is not using proper grammar, we just say that they didn't learn, right? Because you learned grammar. Is it opinion about grammar? Anybody heard of the Chicago School? The Chicago, what do they call it? The Chicago, no, not economics, for language, for English. There's a Chicago, what's it called?
Style book.
Style book, yeah, the Chicago Style. There's a Chicago Style, and that style book is used, that's probably the most used guide, right? So if you publish a book and you don't follow, there are basically 3 main styles, 2 in America, 1 in Europe, 1 in England. There's the New York style. They don't call it New York style, but there's New York style. There's a Chicago style book, and then there's a London style book. And UK. Do not publish a work in America with the UK style book. Half the words are going to be spelled wrong, and the punctuation can be strange or not quite right, because the style book is different. So is this a matter of opinion? It's a matter of opinion which style book you choose, but once you choose one, what is it? It's a standard. It's a fact. It's exacting. You know, and if that's true about language, what is true about other subjects, right? So that's what we're going to look at. Once you know the basics of it, then it's very easy to apply it in every sense, and we can do that. So this is why I said we're beginning kind of an exploration. It's something that's kind of new for people, because the question is, how do you understand truth? What is truth? If you go to school today, if you go to college today, what do they say? Truth is subjective. But wait, we know that's not true. If that were true, then what happens if I turn this light switch on?
Well, if you want the lights to come on, then you come on.
Well, I don't even have to flip a switch, right? If it's subjective, I just go,
Alexa, turn on the lights.
Yeah. Better not ask Alexa with complicated questions, right? We can even look at AI. There's no such thing as AI, but that's all right. The world wants you to believe it. But, as a scientist, I know there's no. Well, that's another point of truth. Once you evaluate it, you'll see things about it. But anyway, here's a question: how do we understand truth? And I know whether you know the techniques or the rules or the standards or not, you know there has to be truth in science, in the physical world, right? Anybody not want to get on an airliner? Well, maybe sometimes airliners, but you know, in airliners, you trust the engineering and you see them flying, right? And you trust them enough to pay them money to go flying on an airliner. Or how about a car? Anybody not have a car because they're afraid that cars and combustion engines are going to blow up when you drive out of your driveway or start it, right? We trust it, so we know that you have to be able to trust things in the physical world. And that's the thing, that Western civilization gives us two methods to know truth in the physical world. We're talking about the physical world. We're going to talk about other things too. So you might get your little cogitators and brains thinking about other things because, because we'll talk about this, it's very important. In the age of reason, empiricism won. So because empiricism won, what do people not believe in today, even though they should? Well, it's not just Jesus, it's a spiritual, it's a whole of the spiritual world. The whole of anything outside of the physical world. Empiricism says if I can't measure it, I can't touch it, I can't smell it or feel it or taste it, does it exist? That's what empiricism says. That's not what anyone in the world believes. That's literally, no one in the world believes that. I'll show you why as we move through this. But the point is you have to understand about how to know truth in the physical world. The physical world is all about empiricism. And Western civilization has created two means to know truth in the physical world. These were invented by the Greeks about 500 BC. In 500 BC, we get the first, I'll talk about history in a second. No other civilization invented these means to know truth. The Greeks were the guys, were the people, okay? This is the great gift of the Greeks to our civilization. The Bible is the way it is because of this. Western civilization is the way it is because of this. And there are no other ways to know truth about events. I say the universe, when I say that, I mean the physical world, the empirical world. So how do you know truth? There are two types of events in the universe. There are repeatable events and non-repeatable events. Probably a good idea to talk about repeatable versus non-repeatable. Okay, so I should have brought a ball with me. If I take a ball and I drop it from a certain height, right? Oh,
Ball, baby.
oh, he's got a ball. Now I should have the equations, right? If I take a ball and I drop this ball from a singular height, right? And I measure the time it takes to drop, and I can measure all kinds of things about it, right? We can actually discover if we drop it, the rate of its fall is going to be what? The same or change?
Exactly the same every time.
It should be exactly the same every time. We'll talk about that. It should be exactly the same every time. Why mightn't it not be?
External factors.
External factors. Because what is governing this ball falling from a set height? Gravity. Yeah, gravity. Gravity is really the only thing that's going against this. There, you have some other things, viscosity, friction of the atmosphere, but the famous experiment, okay, if you remember one of the big fights, the famous experiment, does a feather or a cannonball fall at the same rate in a vacuum? Same rate. They don't change because in a gravity is the only effect. If I take away the atmosphere, if I take away viscosity and the thickness of the atmosphere, they don't change. If I put it in a different substance like water, some things float, some things sink. But you know what? If it's the same substance and the same shape, the famous one was what I think Galileo or somebody took a solid cannonball and a hollow cannonball and dropped it from the Tower of Pisa or something, right? At the same time, and they hit at the same moment. And people were astounded because it's not that it doesn't make sense, it's just they had no idea about gravity. But that's a repeatable event. If I can repeat it, then there is a way to prove the repeatable events. There are non-repeatable events. What's a non-repeatable event? Well, creation, that's a big one.
Thunderstorm.
A thunderstorm. This class, right? This class is an event in time. Now, you may be able to see the recording and see what happened, but it is a historical event. Historical events are not repeatable, unless you believe in deja vu. No. Historical events are non-repeatable. You can't repeat the last second ago. It's impossible. Those are non-repeatable events. And so the tools in the physical world these are how we test them. We can prove them. We call it proof. Because in a repeatable event, you can test and know using the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is taught everywhere. I mean, we've taught that extensively. It was invented by Aristotle. Aristotle is a Greek dude. He was a Greek dude after 399, 400 BC is a very important year. Anybody know what happened in 400 BC? Socrates was forced to drink poison and die in 400 BC. Socrates was one of the great inventors of another method we'll talk about, but his biographer, the guy who wrote down the Socratic dialogues, was a guy called Plato. And Plato was the teacher of a guy called Aristotle. And so around that time, and 400 BC is a great time to remember because just after that, within the 100 years, Aristotle, as far as we know, he's the one who invented the scientific method. The scientific method is what we use to prove repeatable events. And this gets a little complicated, but don't worry about it. You don't have to memorize. There's no test. But the big deal is, how do you do it? You have essential elements that are iterations, recursions, interleavings, and orderings. I got this off. The reason it's so funny is because I got this off a modern site from education. It's easier than that. You just observe things in the world. You observe things. You observe dropping a ball, right? And you say, I'm dropping a ball, and I want to know how long does it take for that ball. What are the forces acting on that ball? So that's I observe it. I have the characterizations. You see, it says there, observations, definitions, measurements of the subject of inquiry. You make a hypothesis. You have predictions. And then you make experiments. It's all about experiments. If it's repeatable, I can experiment. If it's non-repeatable, what's the problem if it's not repeatable? I can never do it again. Yeah. So if it's repeatable, it has to be repeatable. And when I asked you the question about repeatable versus non-repeatable, somebody said creation. The creation, okay, Tammy said creation. The creation of the universe is a non-repeatable event. Unless you believe that the universe keeps collapsing and redoing and collapsing and redoing, then it becomes repeatable. But you got to live long enough to do the experiment. Okay? So the big deal is when you have non-repeatable events, and so I think I put it down here. Let's see. How do you know if it's not the question of rigorous? We'll talk about rigorous. Concept of limitations, requirement for repeatability. You can't prove a non-repeatable event with the scientific method. You can't prove any, you cannot prove any historical events. Now you can prove some ideas around the history using the scientific method. It's a little complicated, but you cannot prove a non-repeatable event. You can't prove history. You can't prove the creation of Big Bang Theory. You cannot prove global warming. Why can't you prove global warming? What's that? You can't repeat it. Yeah, that's right. Anybody know how many experiments in global warming have come to fruition? Zero. It's zero. What is it then? I mean, it's the worldwide issue. It's a theory. Now that comes down to the next thing. You know, we talk about the theory of gravity. Why do we talk about the theory of gravity, though? Why is it a theory? Well, the reason it's a theory is because we don't know what causes gravity, but we observe it. Now, some will say you can observe warming, for example, in the world. Now, whether that's true or not, if I can measure it empirically, right, that becomes a difficult problem. As a scientist, okay, I can, anyway, we may get into that a little bit if we have time in using the tools. But what's most important is you've got to know that using the scientific method, you've got to be able to tell, you use the scientific method to prove repeatable events. And that comes back to rigorous. How do we know if it's rigorous? How do we know if the scientific method can be applied properly? Independent experiments is a good reason. I'm going to give you a little more complex in that, and that's what we call in statistics. We do a statistical analysis. Yes, sir, Jim.
You have to work as hard to disprove your theory as you do to prove it.
I don't disagree with that. However, like for example, the ball example in gravity is a great example, because if I do let's say I do that test, and I'm going to end up with here's like, It's not very bright. I got better ones. I have better ones. I'm using theirs, so I'll use the better one. Here is the time factor difference between the ball hitting the ground. And let's say it's maybe, I don't know, let's say it's a second. So this is right on, and here's a second. What I get is a distribution of answers. And so I should get, more here and fewer here. Look at that, see? And I'll get what's called a bell curve distribution, and I can look at it statistically. We look at it statistically. We cut a center point. You guys have heard of means and modals. Well, there's three of them, right? All that stuff they taught you in school about, finding averages. There's three types of averages. Okay. Anyway, I'm not going to teach you statistics, but we can tell as scientists, we know how to evaluate how rigorous the experiment is. If the experiment's no good, where are we going to find this? It's got to be out here, right? It's going to be outside the standard deviation. This is standard deviation.
You have a really wide curve. You don't have a tight bell.
That's right. You won't have a tight bell curve, and it may not be, it'll be all messed up.
You can't just do this one time. You have to have a big sample size.
It's got to be statistically real.
It has to be, yes. And statistically, okay, I'll throw this out for you. In safety of flight for aircraft, we use a 99% confidence. I love to tell people this because it's kind of scary. For safety of flight, we use a 99% confidence. That means we statistically know, like for example, for landings, right? For landing tests, you want to make sure that you're going to land in the right distance. So you statistically do it at 99% confidence because you want to know that 99% of the time you're going to land in a certain distance. That's good, right? For non-safety of flight, we use a 95% confidence. What do they use for drug tests? Anybody know? What's the confidence interval for drug tests, for human drug tests?
25.
What's that?
25.
No, that would be too low. At 50%, you don't know if you asked the right question. A 50% confidence means I don't know if it's right or it's wrong, right? In a drug test, we use 51% confidence. A 51% confidence. This is how come you can get away with, when you do flight tests, you usually do like at least maybe 1,000 landings. When you do a drug test, how many people do you have in your drug test? Maybe, if you have 10, you're lucky. 10 control, 10 placebo, and 10 that are getting the real drug.
When you talk drug testing, you're not talking low end of the analyzer. You're talking about what drug companies do to prove that a drug is safe.
Oh, and drug, they do it for drug analyzers too, but yeah, for safety. Part of the problem is you want to have big, that's the thing, all this stuff we're talking about has to do with the scientific method. And the scientific method is, and I'll mention this, although we will talk about this when we talk about health and drugs and things. But, part of the problem with you guys know what the Asian problem is, right, with drugs? Many Asian cultures believe that it's immoral to give placebo and immoral not to have a control. The control doesn't get anything. The placebo gets a placebo because placebo effect is about 20% in drugs. You know that? So if you even take a fake sugar pill, what's that? Okay, there's our doctor telling us it's 40%. Most of the literature says about 20, but I'll go for 40. Placebo can be huge. So when you do a drug test, you've got to have a control, a placebo, and the actual drug. In many Asian cultures, like China, for example, it's considered immoral to do a placebo or a control. So guess what? What's your drug test going to show? Who knows? If you don't use the scientific method, you're not going to be there. Hey, Reggie, you have another point to make? Or that's a good point. I like it when people give me good data. I'll use that as a good data point. But anyway, do you see how important this is? but for repeatable events. Repeatable. So there is another method. Yeah, they got down here right next. Okay, for non-repeatable events, you got to move on to the historical method. The historical method. Now, I'm going to probably tell you this early. We stopped teaching the historical, it's called the historical legal method. It's not the historical critical method of analysis of scripture. Some people may have heard of that. It's considered a very negative method for evaluating scripture. It has nothing to do with this. The historical legal method is basically what they will do when you go to a court of law. I hope none of you have been to a court of law. I have sued the government multiple times, even to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. This is what they're supposed to use for that method. And what is it called? It's sometimes called the evidentiary method, the evidentiary witness method, but it is the method you use to evaluate crimes, criminal activity. When a person has committed a crime, we put them in jail. We can execute them based on the historical legal method. The historical legal method is what, if you go to law school, that's what law school is all about today. They stopped teaching it, and I'll mention a sideline of why they stopped teaching it at the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1900s, they stopped teaching this generally, but we'll go through a little bit of history of that too. The evidentiary method, you have the evidence witness. So you usually have oral, written, and exhibits. Oral, somebody witnessed a crime. Written, somebody wrote a note about a crime that happened. Exhibits, you have the gun, you have the weapon, etc. Now, the thing about the legal historical method, I'm talking about a court of law, but what do we normally use this method to prove? History. How do you know George Washington existed? Do you know that George Washington existed?
Somebody wrote about it.
Well, when George Washington was alive, you had oral testimony from people that saw him. And you have his oral testimony, right? Unfortunately, they didn't have recording devices until Thomas Edison. So what you're left with today is written evidence. Did you know he wrote stuff? Oh, George, he wrote stuff. People wrote stuff about George. I've got lots of data, and I have exhibits. I got his teeth. I got his hair. I got,
His pew that he sat on.
His pew.
In the church.
He did. I went to his church, Pohick Church. George Washington and George Mason built Pohick Church, and it's an Anglican church, and I've actually seen his pew. And that's where he went to church. It's really cool. Anyway, so you have this evidence witness, and you have merit. Merit is how well an event in history passes evidentiary tests, and then you have degree. Primary degree is firsthand. In a court of law, for example, if you saw the murder, you're a primary witness. You're a firsthand witness. You're allowed. On the other hand, a secondary witness. What's a secondary witness?
I told someone about the murder.
Yeah, I told somebody about it. What do we call that in a court?
Hearsay.
Hearsay. Is it allowed? It is not allowed in a court of law. However, we use it a lot in history. What's most of the hearsay evidence we use in history? Newspaper accounts. Newspaper accounts are all secondary accounts. Why? I use the example of Lincoln's assassination. John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat segregationist who was a slave, supported slavery, murdered the Republican president was watching a play, and his wife saw it. His wife is a direct and primary witness. The newspaper guy that came and talked to his wife and said, "What did you see?" That is what kind of? That's a secondary. Now, what's a tertiary? Anybody ever read a history book?
Yes, that's the read history.
History books are all tertiary witness. Historical fiction, sorry to say, I write historical fiction. Historical fiction is tertiary witness. Okay, you might have quotes, which makes it a little better. You have quotes, you have, observations. When I write history, for example, what do you think I use to study history? Primary and secondary sources. The secondary sources are pretty good. That's many times all you got. But yeah, primary and secondary. But then I use that to write tertiary. Tertiary means kind of gurgitated. You're trying to explain the historical events to people. But it's tertiary. Can it be used in a court of law? Not supposed to be. That's an interesting problem we have in America. There's also none. Okay, what is none? People's opinions. You ever heard of the Book of the Dead? The Egyptian Book of the Dead. What kind of history is the Egyptian Book of the Dead? The Book of the Dead is a book of spells that you're supposed to use when you're dead. Who wrote them? Live guys. They never were dead. Okay, so that's not a primary witness, a secondary witness, or a tertiary witness. The dead guys couldn't write it. So it's none. It's opinion, right? And I usually teach this in my classes when I teach about the religious documents, right? We look at the Old Testament and New Testament, which we'll talk about in this class. I won't do a proof text to them, but it's very easy to prove using the legal historical method that all the documents in the New Testament, especially, New Testament is really easy to prove. But you know what? All the other documents that are used religiously, very difficult to prove. Impossible to prove. Now, you want to know why they stopped teaching the legal historical method in the beginning of the 20th century? Why do you think they stopped using that method? Because if I use that method and I teach school kids, I teach high school kids, I teach college kids, what is your only conclusion about the New Testament, especially New Testament documents? Is what? They're accurate, they're truth, using the legal historical method. But if I do the same thing with the Bhagavad Gita or Taoism or with the Shinto documents, what do I get? Or what do I get? Nothing. Ain't nothing. They're other. Okay? This is basics of life. People don't like this. So they said, oh, well, we can't teach people the legal historical method. They might conclude that the New Testament is accurate. Ooh, we can't have that happening. Can't do that. Anyway, in all my classes for the New Testament documents, I prove their veracity. And that's the reason I do it, is to prove the veracity. I do the same thing with the Old Testament. The Old Testament's harder, but we do that too. Anyway, we use this method here, the method of the legal historical method, to prove non-repeatable events. So, when we evaluate any kind of thing, any kind of idea, what do you got to apply it to? In the physical world, you got to do what? You can apply two different methods. Are there any other methods? Well, I'll tell you the end of the story. There are no other methods to prove truth in the physical world. There is a method we use in the courts, and I'll talk about that in another class, called the harm method. But, this is what we teach the legal historical to the lawyers. They use it in law. That's how they put you in jail. To execute people for crimes. Method was taught rigorously until the 19th, 20th century. And like I said, that's why it's not taught much in modern education. If you teach these methods, what can you not say to people? Truth is relative. If truth is provable, is it relative? Is it opinion-based? No. It can't can't be, if you can prove it, it's not opinion-based. If it's real, you can't just make up stuff, although they do. That's funny. Anyway, that's why I tell you, in my classes, when I teach the Bible class, when I teach about the Bible, I prove the veracity of the text. I prove the veracity of the things I'm doing. And by the way, since they're in a language, remember we started this about language? I told you about languages and grammar. Do you think language and grammar apply to Greek and Hebrew? They apply to English. Now, spelling rules didn't apply until we invented dictionaries, but that was Webster and what's his name, Johnson. Anyway, so the main problem with education is how education views the world, not the methods to know truth. So I've given you the two methods. Why are we where we are? This is why we are where we are. This is why we have a problem. Okay, first of all, in the beginning of education, the beginning of education was to understand the world as it is. And philosophy, philosophia in Greek, when we look at it in Greek as a technical term, philosophia is a little more complex than you imagine. I won't go into those details, but we all know that philosophy is the love of wisdom. Philosophia means, and actually it's the warrior love of wisdom, but philo has become, Philadelphia, the city of friendship. Be careful, you might get shot. But, philosophia is supposed to be the love of sophistry, the love of wisdom. And it means, like I said, warrior. Phileo is the warrior, is a warrior's love. But anyway, philosophy is a study of the forces in the world. What we generally call philosophy is not really philosophy. What we're calling philosophy means logic or esoteric reasoning, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But real philosophy is a study of things as they are. What is important about this is when all the educational systems started, the purpose when I talk about education, I mean higher education, like collegiate level, university level education. When people began to teach at that level, their whole purpose was to study the world as it is. Now, as you know, that becomes a little of a problem. The Greeks invented their tools, the legal historical method and the scientific method, to be able to prove what they should study, what should be under philosophy. But originally, philosophy included theology, or theology included philosophy. They were both the same. Why is that? Because originally the Greeks viewed thought and understanding in terms of theology and philosophy. They include each other. It's a pagan worldview, paganism, and it comes from animism. Because before you know that, like, for example, gravity causes things to drop, what do early religions believe causes, well, they don't even know about gravity, but what would they think causes fire or causes rivers to flow? Gods, yeah, gods, and that's what a little g kind of gods. And I'm going to even make it more specific. They believe that spirits were in everything that moved, rivers. Even today in Shintoism, if you go look and see what are rivers in Asian thought? Dragons. The spirit of dragons are the rivers. In the air, the spirit of birds. In Greek thought, the birds were the messengers between the gods. The gods were stars, etc., etc. So in the pagan worldview, you have animism. There's spirits and gods and everything. The Greeks never saw a difference between the two. That is between the physical world and the theological world. Even though they were able to invent their things, the problem is that they did not understand physical forces. But they invented the scientific method. What does the scientific method allow you to figure? About forces, right? Because if you know what makes a fire, right? It's no longer a spirit. If you know that a spark in combustion, you have to have an oxidizer, you have to have a fuel, and you have to have a spark. If I've got all three, suddenly it's a scientific method and it's not my opinion. It's not like I'm going to make fire with my brain, right? Which never worked anyway. So using the scientific method, you figure this out. Now, early colleges in education saw the same concept in the world. That is, all the training in early colleges was in theology. It originated in paganism, the world was all about gods, but that continued as a worldview in Christianity because the world was all about God, right? And so all basic degrees were in theology. Everybody who went to college and university got a degree in theology. In Aristotelian thought, the same method, European law gradually changed that because what did we learn? We learn more about the physical world. We learn more about empiricism. We learn more about how to measure it, how to evaluate it using repeatable methods. And so, therefore, we got law, which is the historical legal method, and we got medicine, which is scientific method. And so, you notice, you can't use either of these methods to prove any concept in theology. So how do you prove God? There's a third method for determining truth, also developed by the Greeks, and that's called logic. And I'm loosely describing that, but it directly relates to theology and philosophy. I didn't mention it to you yet because it's more than a bumper sticker. At this time, we began to get advanced degrees in theology, law, and medicine. What was Abraham Lincoln's degree? Was that?
Law.
No, theology.
Theology was philosophy.
He got a degree in theology. Matter of fact, a PhD. I have a PhD, Doctor of Philosophy. Not a Doctor of Science. Now, you can be a Doctor of Law. You can be a Doctor of Medicine. You have a Doctor of Theology today, right?
I saw it was piled higher and deeper.
It is. It's piled higher and deeper. It don't mean nothing. But the big deal is that people think that our educational system just started the way it was, right? And it magically is what it is. Well, you got to ask yourself the question, why do we call, doctors of science? Remember, all doctoral degrees that are considered, you have a BS, an MS, a PhD, they're all doctors of philosophy. But you do have specialized teaching or specialized graduate degrees, and it's because of what happened in the past to reflect what was happening in medieval Europe and in Renaissance Europe. At the end of the Age of Enlightenment, the beginning of the Age of Reason, the pesky Germans began to carve philosophy out of theology. Why did they do that? Why do you think they began to pull philosophy out of theology? They didn't like the conclusions that theology starts with. Theology starts with what conclusion? There's a God. Yeah, or gods. And they didn't like that. They wanted to pull the empiricists. That's why, look, at the end of the Age of Enlightenment, what was the beginning? The Age of Reason was the age of empiricism, right? And the problem with the age of empiricism is you view the world in terms of the physical. There are problems with that. We'll talk about that in the future, but right here. But universities began to offer advanced degrees in philosophy, theology, medicine, and law, which basically that was around the 1900s. Here, I got this mentioned here, et cetera, philosophy. Remember, philosophy is by definition the study of the world as it is. use the scientific method, legal historical method exclusively. There's a problem though. The problem is there are concepts in the world that are constructs, such as mathematics, and there are concepts outside the physical world. Now, I know you're all empiricists. I'm sorry. Let's hope we're not all empiricists. But because of our education, we are mostly empiricists in our thinking, because the empiricist won. We go to church, we worship God, but at the same time, we have a real problem with the spiritual and with the supernatural, right? Don't people have a problem with that? We have a problem with that. We have faith. But you want me to tell you something? It's not about faith. Because the physical world can only be understood in terms of the methods, the scientific method, legal historical method. How do you understand mathematics? Mathematics is not repeatable. What is mathematics? It's infinitely repeatable. In other words, it's always, okay, 1 plus 2, well, actually, under set theory, I got a problem. The reason I got a problem is 1 plus 1 equals 2. Let's say I have 1 apple and 1 orange. Well, I got 1 apple, 1 orange. Now I have 2 pieces of fruit, but a fruit is a type of set. Remember that set theory they tried to teach you that you forgot about it, nobody cares about? It really is important. Set theory is really important. The problem is, okay, so let's say I have a green apple and a red apple. If my set is apples, I got 2 apples. But if my set is green apples, I got, and if my set is red apples, yeah. Do you see this? This is, and if you have orange, you have 0. This is really important because mathematics is not definable by either the legal historical method or by the scientific method. And part of the problem is, okay, we have probability, chaos math, chaos itself, thought, emotions. Can I measure emotions? Boy, huh?
They try, there's scales and all kinds of.
People try. How about pain? Can I really measure pain? Who's 1 to 10? The telos, the beginning of the universe, the prime mover, the creator, God. Here's the biggest problem with probability in science. Okay, so anybody heard of Heisenberg? I'm giving you all kinds of good stuff. Heisenberg, when I was, I studied my undergraduates in chemistry. And in chemistry, we study Heisenberg equations. What's Heisenberg equation? Anybody have any idea? This is what they taught you. They taught you this. Here's the proton of the atom, and if the proton is that size, that's about a golf ball, right? How big is the electron and how far away is it? Average. 5 kilometers. 5 kilometers, and it's the size of a pinhead. Okay, that's if you go measure it. Now, where is the electron really, according to Heisenberg equation? Yeah, it's infinite. However, by probability, it is in a sphere that is approximately 5 kilometers in size. If the proton is the size of a golf ball, it's approximately 5 kilometers within a 5 kilometer space. So probability says, where am I going to find it probability-wise? Somewhere in that space, including in the middle of the proton. This is true, and we've expanded Heisenberg. When I was in school, we expanded Heisenberg to the helium atom, which is really complicated. It really looks cool, too. But the big deal is, what is governing atoms in atomic theory?
Probability.
Probability. And matter of fact, what did Einstein say? The famous quote. I don't believe that God rolls dice. But yet God created the universe with probability as a mathematical basis. Mathematics, though, becomes very complicated because if the basis of the universe is probability, then the mathematics gets even more complicated because that means that the answer to the math sometimes is completely accurate and sometimes is what? I have to have a probability sphere or stuff. It even works with chaos math. I've worked in chaos math. Chaos math is becoming very complicated, but chaos math is almost the opposite of probability. Chaos math says that no matter how infinitely not regular it looks, when you get down at a micro level enough, it looks more and more regular. We see this in flows, chaotic flows, whatever. You don't care. But you know, when you turn on a tap, right? When you turn on a tap, you get laminar flow first, and then you turn a little bit higher. What happens? It gets chaotic. It gets bubbly. That's chaotic. That's chaos flow. In any case, the math itself gets really complicated, and mathematics cannot be used. You can't use the historical method. You can't use the scientific method. You can't use it for probability. You can calculate probabilities, but you can't tell where stuff is. You can use chaos math, chaos itself, thought and emotions. Boy, let's say somebody looks at you like and says, I'm not angry. Right? What do you got to use to figure that one out? Logic. The Greeks invented logic because they realized that many times empiricism doesn't work because what do people do about their thoughts and emotions all the time? Yeah, hide them, lie, obfuscate. Why? Because we don't want to know, go to an Asian culture and say, do I have bad breath? You will, okay, if you're going to answer, either your breath is so bad or that person is considered a pariah in their society because they won't tell you. It's even hard for people to tell you in our culture, do I have bad breath? Well, you have perfectly great smelling lilac breath, right? I'm just telling you, how is the world and how do we figure it out? And that's through logic. Logic. That is the method of proving it. And so what is logic? I only have a few minutes left today, but we can talk about this more. You can't prove God using the scientific, legal, historical method. You can't do it. Why? Why can't you do it? Well, it's not empirical, right? It's not a physical thing that you can measure and see. It's like mathematics. Mathematics, the only way you can do mathematics, you write it on paper, right? Or you do examples, or you can make examples. But
Well, he's right. You were there as listing the two methods, so you can't repeat it, and there was no witness.
exactly. You can't repeat it, there's no witness. And so, you've got to use logic when you move outside. Now, I'm gonna finish this. Oh, I've got it in here anyway. You've got to have a method that proves things that are not physical or obvious, or repeatable or non-repeatable. The Greeks knew this, and I've got it here. The spiritual, mental, emotional, atomic world, by definition, does not act repeatable means. So why the atomic world? Because it's done by probability. Legal, historical is closer. Spiritual, mental, emotional cannot be perceived. Here's the example. All right. Am I touching this table? No. What am I doing? What is happening? I feel something. What's happening here? If my molecules, if my atoms were to intermix with the atoms of this table, okay, either my finger would go through it or I'd have a fusion explosion, right? Or a fission explosion. Take your pick. The reason that my finger does not go through this table is because the atomic structure of this table and the atomic structure of my finger they're repulsing each other. Which is really interesting because they're electrons and protons. Bazillions of them. So if I can't physically touch it, how do I make an empirical measurement? Well, that goes back to the historical method, the scientific method. If it's repeatable, I can measure it. But the problem is, I got this thing going on that's literally impossible to measure. I can measure the force on this table, but yet that does not represent the invisible atomic world that's going on with that table. The Greeks, by the way, every culture believes that there is something beyond the empirical. We believe there's something beyond the empirical. How do I know? Anybody use mathematics? If you're using mathematics, you're using something beyond the empirical. How about do you have thoughts, emotions? All these are beyond the empirical. We're going to pick up, I'll continue to explain about logic next week. But logic is that third method that we use to know truth. And once we understand logic, we can really understand a lot of the foundations of the basis of how we approach the problems of putting the empirical, that is the historical method and the scientific method together with logic so that we can prove things that are beyond the empirical. And that's the whole point, right? What's the whole point of philosophy? To prove who is God. Prove God. We'll talk about it. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look at us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.